And we're live.
Hello.
Hi, Kat. How's it going?
Hey, Todd. I'm good. Thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Hi, everyone else. This is another episode of Coaching Conversation, and I am here. This is really special for me because, Kat, you and I have done this before. I'm here with my very good friend, Kat, who I've done some of these live conversations with in another context. But so, Kat, let's start off, and why don't you introduce yourself? I love these live things because I can make a whole bunch of mistakes. Why don't you introduce yourself? And we're here to talk about power, but you go ahead.
So I'm Catarina von Maydell. Kat is perfectly preferred, actually. And I do strategic coaching. Really where I'm going is working with leaders who are really serious about making change, and really helping them from various levels figure out where the change is that they can make and how they can actually engage in that. So right now I'm focusing on working with individual leaders, and it's a very multifaceted approach that I use, and it really is where they're ready to start. But the key thing is they have something that they really are ready to act on, and how can I help them really make the impact that's possible. And most of the time, the people that I work with are ones who've tried quite a few things, and for one reason or another get stuck. And it's usually because there's a whole bunch of invisible things that they're not seeing, and I can help them sort of see those invisible things, make them visible.
That's important. Well, and particularly, I think, probably also within the context of this conversation. So we call this conversation "Curious About Power?" ? With an expectation that folks will be curious about power. But before we even go into the curiosity part, why don't we talk about what we mean by power? Because if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll get a really wide assortment of things. So what do we mean when we're talking about power within the context of this conversation?
Yeah. So in this context where we are speaking to people who are in business, they're probably reasonably established in their careers. What I mean by power is the ability to make people do what you want them to do. And there's generally two ways of doing that. Number one is by force, which is kind of the stuff that we often think about when we talk about power. And this is probably one of the reasons I think that power is such a taboo topic, is because we just assume it's negative. We assume, and it's usually because we've had power used against us forcefully. But there's a lot of times where the more effective element of power is the informal, the persuasion, negotiation, influence, all of those things. If we use words like persuasion and influence, we often assume there's a positive element, that it's nicey nice. And as soon as we use the word negotiation, we sort of jump to the idea of zero-sum game. But the reality is this soft power, this soft approach, as opposed to the hard approach, the resources that people can use versus the persuasion element, that's ultimately where power comes from. Because you can have a whole bunch of people, we see it throughout history, where there's people that inherit huge amounts of formal power, wealth, military, roles and responsibilities, etc., and they lose power because they didn't know how to play the soft power game.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like within a business context, and I realize we're probably talking about something bigger, but within a business context, people talk about command and control leadership versus servant leadership. And I think maybe what you're discussing is the same thing, but at scale. And in the same kind of way that those soft skills that, people, are nowadays, sort of being asked to develop at work. The truth is that those soft skills are in fact quite difficult to develop. They're not things that necessarily come naturally to a lot of people. It's not something you learn in leadership school if you got an MBA or something, right? What you learn is that force power that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So it's what I think it also probably means that it's what we're conditioned to look for.
Yes.
When we think about power. Okay.
Yeah.
So
and whenever we touch on soft power, I think I might be repeating myself, so I'll make it quick. A lot of times we think of either soft power as being nice. Did I say please and thank you? Am I being respectful? Am I pretending to listen to you? And we often equate, like oversimplify what influence actually is. And we also oversimplify what negotiation is. And we always think it's sort of an aggressive adversarial negotiation, when in fact, negotiation can actually be extremely constructive and fun. Yeah. And influence can actually be pretty toxic if it's done the wrong way. Yeah. So a lot of times we just really oversimplify and put these really simplistic labels of good and bad
Right.
on whatever aspects there are.
Right. So that's fascinating to me because you know, before we turn the camera on, or before we turn the recording on, we were talking about you know, sort of the multi sides of influence. You know, and I think that you had described, you know, a situation, and I was like, oh, that's propaganda. And I was like, no, no, no. And what's interesting to me is, like, I wonder, like, does force operate, or do you think that force operates with that multifaceted thing as well?
Well, if you think about police forces, right? Even the word force is in there. Yeah.
Right.
Um,
Sorry, is that an example? Is that an example of good or bad?
well, that's what I'm trying to find the right way to phrase it is, if police forces do what a healthy society wants them to do, which is maintain order, yeah, and to act on disorder, if it's done in a healthy way, they're absolutely good. And quite bluntly, I don't really want to live in a society that doesn't have a reasonably healthy police force. Yeah. But the problem is, when there's not accountability, when it's not being managed properly, then it can become very toxic. And also, if they're operating in a society that has toxic elements, such as racism, misogyny, whatever else, then those behaviors may not be checked when they should be, right? So there's multiple reasons why people attach the label bad to the police forces. And there's probably a very good reason for it. It's not probably, there are very good reasons for it. And at the same time, when policing is done well, we're all better off because of it. So there's an accountability element. There's a reflection of society element. Yeah.
Well, and frankly, I think a reflection of power, because, you know, if and I know that we're in the stratosphere, and I'm going to want to sort of bring us down to earth in a second, but you know, if I think of police as the example, right, there's, like, someone is in charge, like there is some force, to use the language that we were talking about, in charge up there, and if that force is, you know, benevolent, right, but even force, like when I think of in terms of you know, the application of force power, like the phrase that pops into my head, you know, for good is benevolent dictator, which is never really benevolent. And
well,
right,
it can be until they're not benevolent anymore. The problem is there's no accountability. And if we look at the city of Toronto's police, what's it called? Toronto Police, whatever they're called.
Yeah, the
TPS?
TPF, TPD,
whatever.
Yeah.
The police in Toronto, they have a board which has civilian people, as I believe it includes civilians and some politicians, for oversight. And they have accountabilities in other ways. Yeah, so there always should be checks and balances. This is what democracy is all about, is to have checks and balances. Yes, we say we're going to give power to some people in this context. However, we need to have checks and balances. The problem is when those accountabilities are not working well, then the people with power can absolutely run off the rails. Right? So that's a systemic problem. To blame it on any one person or any one thing is kind of missing the point of how democracy works well, which is the allocation of power. Probably not the right word, but it's like, how do we decide where and when do we give power to other people to have power over us, right?
Maybe that's a good segue, because you know, I think particular police is a really interesting example, because I think we could go on and on and on about that. And what I'd really like to do is start talking about you know, what's the so what in here, like, and obviously, you know, we're we're in a geopolitical landscape right now where power is being exerted in a way that probably most of us haven't seen in our lifetimes, unless we go way back. So maybe people from my parents' generation. And it's possible, not possible, it's likely that most of us sort of aren't accustomed to, at least in North America and parts of Europe, aren't accustomed to sort of witnessing that. And it's showing up in other places too, because the influence of what's happening is showing up at work, showing up in corporations. So what's the so what? Like if we bring it down to, why should I care? What do I do about it? How do we operate in that context?
There's two answers I would give to that. Number one is we've had the luxury, most of us who are white middle class in North America, we've had the luxury of not having to care about power because there was a good enough justice system that we could get through our day-to-day lives over years and everything worked well. Yeah. If we had a problem, we'd take it to court if we needed to. If we had a criminal problem, we could call the police. And for most of us middle-class white people, we could trust the police, right? So, and government, yeah, we complain about how obnoxious government is, but on the whole, most of our governments were pretty honest. Again, because there was accountability, not because people are more or less honest, right? But as accountability systems break down, then the people who move into power are the ones who are often not with the best intentions. Yeah. What we've seen is an exodus of a lot of really good people from politics and other places in power because they didn't like how the game was being played. Because the rules were breaking down, because the accountabilities are breaking down. And we've seen this everywhere, and it's been happening over the last 30 years, if not possibly longer. And it doesn't matter what we talk about, the accountability system, the reason we have so much egregious behavior, I mean, business people are always there's always going to be bad apples in the business world. But the fact that we've had some pretty egregious corporate behaviors is because there isn't accountability for them, not because corporations in and of themselves are bad. The reason that we have politicians doing what they're doing is because a lot of the checks and balances that were put in place were either weakened or not enforced. Yeah. So we no longer have the luxury of not paying attention. That's reason number one, is that we absolutely have to pay attention because people have hijacked the systems. They've destroyed the accountability systems. And now we have a choice where either we can step up or we can't. And that takes me to point number two, is the reason we need to care about power is because we are absolutely not helpless in this situation. But the question is, are we going to take the power that we do have and use it effectively?
Well, I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's easy within this context to feel powerless, and I think what I'm hearing is that your thesis is that we're anything but. Right. So, and perhaps that's the segue into hope. Like there is hope within this context that within this context where we're witnessing people, using power in very different ways for, I don't want to get into details, but, for their own, enrichment or whatever the reasons are. And as individuals within communities of our own, we have access to power that we didn't have before. And I think that, I guess, and this is so funny because this is meant to be a conversation, but I feel like I'm just asking you questions. Like, how? Like, how do I recognize it? If I've had a life, had a career where I've acquiesced, I've worked under command and control leaders, where I've, done the thing that I'm supposed to do and been a good worker and, showed up where I'm supposed to, but I've ended up like so many people in corporate North America with a frayed nervous system and kind of going, wait a minute, how come I've just end up hurt? And now I'm confronted with sort of this context that you're describing. how do I even recognize what power looks like for myself?
Most people don't. And most people really have such a negative aversion to it. Before I answer that, there's two
Mm-hmm.
comments. So John wants to introduce a distinction.
Oh yeah.
Um,
So John, if you want to do that, feel free to put it in the chat and we can talk about it.
yeah,
But Tanya also, should
yeah.
we go to Tanya's comment first?
And so I would say this is actually the segue into, so I think activism, I think if we are adults, if we are functioning adults, if we're functioning humans, we're
Mm-hmm.
citizens. Yeah. And we all have an obligation to behave as citizens, which means we shouldn't just get the benefits of society. We are responsible for forming our society.
Right.
And it really, I'm saying society, I don't really care which environment people work in. So to me, activism, Tanya, if you're using the word activism as an ongoing obligation as a citizen, yes, I would agree with activism. If activism is just my life is uncomfortable currently and I'm pissed off and I'm going to fight back, that to me is not activism. That's just immature behavior. So,
Mm-hmm.
Tanya, on that definition of activism, that we as citizens have obligations, as business members of the business community, as members of our individual communities,
Mm-hmm.
we should always be activist. Yeah. We should always be looking for how do we engage in conversations that really go to the areas or common interests.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, John, that's an interesting point. There could be a permission to allow power to prevent further
Here,
harm.
let's bring this up.
If somebody's causing harm, there is no permission.
Mm.
Yeah. And this is like, we have to understand that there are people who have power who are benign
Mm-hmm.
and well intentioned. But if we are not stepping up and working with them and claiming the power that we have and stepping up and fully participating, then if we're not doing that, then we deserve to have power used against us, because that's the nature of power. The nature of power is not evil, but the nature of us sitting back and waiting for people to do things for us, if we give them permission, then nothing good is going to happen. And the people with the power will do whatever they choose to do. It could be benign, it could be not benign, right? So in the word permission, in the circumstances that we're in right now, I'm just rereading what you're saying. There could be a permission to allow power to prevent further harm. Yeah, it's the people with power right now. Many of the people with power, not all,
Mm-hmm.
are doing what they're doing because nobody's pushing back against them.
Mm.
So they've been given permission to do what they're doing. If we want to change course, then we have to step up and say, permission denied, you cannot do any more of this, or we have to do it in a different way.
Yeah. You know it's interesting because I think what I'd love to I hear what you're saying, and I think in a different way is sort of the introduction or the entry point into exercising sort of agency as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to go back to what you talked about with respect to activism as well. Because
That's
and
the
you
fun
know
part.
it, be like, well, and you also know my past, right? So I've got an interesting relationship with activism. So I think it's an interesting relationship. But what I loved about what you said was you know, it's not like there's a why that's beyond the individual in that case. So like, you know, there's an opportunity to use or to seize my individual power, my piece of it or whatever, right? But there's a so what that follows it, that goes beyond I'm uncomfortable, I don't like this thing that's happening because of me or my immediate family or my immediate surroundings or whatever, right? There's a broader, bigger why that's at work. And it's that broader, bigger why that creates power at scale, I think. And it's interesting if we go back to the very beginning of this conversation, you know, force power versus influence power.
Mm.
It's like that at scale is really an example of force power, isn't it?
No, it doesn't have to be.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not sure if this is addressing exactly what you're getting at, but let me try it from a different perspective.
Sure.
Um, when people are only motivated by their self-interest, and there's nothing wrong with self-interest, we have to operate from a self-interest perspective because nobody else can do it for us, right?
Hmm.
But we also have to, at the same time, have the balance of what is the interest of other people.
Hmm.
If you believe that the only way that we survive and thrive is in community, whatever community means, so a shared economy, the reason we have a political system is so that the reason we have bureaucracy and
Hmm.
politicians is in order to outsource and give power to people so that we can create a better society. It's supposed to be by the people, for the people, right?
Hmm.
If you believe that we are better off in community and that we have to share power, not share power, but allocate power or distribute power in
Hmm.
order to get things done so that we as a society are better off, then this activism conversation is relevant. The problem is there are the people who are capturing power and have been capturing power over the last decades are the people who subscribe to Ayn Rand's way of life, which is
Supporting it.
you're sovereign individual.
Hmm.
Everything is your making. This idea of community is, superficial and transactional, right?
Hmm.
So if you believe in the sovereign individual, that book and the ethics behind it, the ethos behind it, sorry,
Hmm.
um, and you really believe that everybody's independent and we can survive without community, then this conversation is not for you, right? So
Hmm.
there is a belief system that goes with what I'm about to say. But the
Hmm.
reality is, we don't survive as individuals. And if we only play zero sum transactional games, those are the societies that end up collapsing. They might survive for a while, but they become so toxic that eventually they collapse. The societies that are the longest lived are the ones that are in collaboration at different points in time in different ways, right?
Hmm.
So the ideal of democracy, and we're never going to get to the ideal of democracy is collaboration. And collaboration, the way that I define it, which is the definition I use, is co-learning and co-creation. And
Hmm.
not everything needs to be co-learning, not everything needs to be co-creation. So we don't need to be in collaboration all the time.
Right.
But democracy, the ideal of democracy is that when we're running into problems or when there are significant groups of people who are feeling marginalized, that we can hear them out and say, what do you need? What's happening? And how can we discover what the common ground is that we're losing?
Hmm.
And how do we then move forward to create that world that really is serving more people more effectively? And it's not a matter of sharing things, of cooperating, which is basically dividing things and saying, you get this and I get this. It's about how do we create win-win scenarios where we're actually creating a sum greater than its parts, right?
Hmm.
That's the ideal. And the more that we can strive for that, the more we can get there. But that requires that everybody commits to participating.
So what I'm also hearing is there is some portion of the people who are listening to us talk right now who are going
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, that's cool, and what do I do,
Yeah.
and like, and how do I step into that, and what's the thing? And I work with leaders, that struggle with this as well, and want
Yeah.
to step into their own power, want to step into
Everybody
making the
struggles with
difference
this.
that they want to make. And
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what this boils down to, because there's lots and lots and lots of places where you can apply yourself. It's not
Yeah.
like, as an individual, I can't possibly apply myself to every single thing,
Yeah.
but there's something that sparks my passion. There's something that's
Yeah.
important to me.
And
And
that's the
yeah.
place to start. And I
Mhm.
think, this idea of collaboration, that's where our real power for the average person, that's where our power comes from, is not from me standing up and trying to figure out how do I, win this. I mean, I can do
Mhm.
that, but it'll only get me so far. If we
Right.
actually really want to rebuild a society that is healthier for more people,
Mm-hmm.
and that is healthier overall, the environment and whatever else. And I've got
Mm-hmm.
beliefs on what that would look like, and everybody else will have slightly different beliefs, but we're going to have common
Mm-hmm.
elements to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you recognize that, the individual aggressive person is going to win against the collaborative individual person.
Mm-hmm.
But there is no way that individualistic societies can ever outcompete collaborative societies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to have a collaborative society, what each of us needs to do is to recognize what you said earlier on. We all have agency. We all have choice.
Mm-hmm.
We all have power. Because if we know how to use words, we can convince people, we can influence people to think differently. We all have specific expertise and experience. And if we can share those in ways that people want to listen to us, we have more influence, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at minimum, anybody who's got a voice, if they learn how to use it effectively, and there is a game to that, but if you learn the skills of it, you can have influence. And then if you're willing to listen to other people and engage and try to figure out, even if I completely disagree with somebody, what's the common ground and how can we start working together? And there's some really interesting, there was an article on LinkedIn a few days ago where somebody said, there was an article that came out that basically said the people on the right care about the climate just as much. They just use different words. And then somebody else published an article and said, here's how we talk about the climate. Here's how they talk about the climate, right? And it was this list of the things that, Democratic people how they would talk about climate versus how Republicans talk about climate. But we still care about the same thing, right? So how do we get to that commonality and then figure out how do we move forward, right?
Yeah, that's a bit of a bomb to drop.
Yeah,
there's like 3 minutes to go. But,
sorry.
but all good. And I think and what I love about it, Kat, is that it sort of speaks to me about the importance of building alignment rather than absolute agreement.
Yeah.
Because what's really important is that as activists, as community-based leaders, as whatever, right? Are we moving in generally the right direction or the same direction, or not? And that speaks to, do I just care about myself or do I care about other people as well? And that's part of what you're describing too. And I think that there's definitely sort of alignment in that space.
Yeah.
And
we'll never agree on everything, and we don't need to.
Nor should we.
Yeah.
That would be boring. And we wouldn't learn anything.
No, it's the conversation and the constant learning that keeps it fresh, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Listen, I think we could go on and on and on, but we are coming at, we are. I think we could. But we are coming up to the end of this conversation, and I'm really glad to have had it with you. Are there any last words that you'd like to leave everyone with?
Recognize you do have power. It may not look like traditional power. For some people, you've got, formal power, but your informal power is even stronger in most cases. So use that to connect to people, especially ones that you don't agree with. Use that power to listen and to really, truly understand. And then figure out, pick the topic that you care about and really focus on how can you move the agenda forward to get to a more civil society. And I'm using the word society. I don't care if we talk about it in business, communities, families. It really doesn't matter. Politics.
A corporation is a society of sorts.
It is. Yeah.
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 Interesting. Yeah. I love that. And thank you. It's like, there's a phrase that we use in Coactive that comes up for me. And it's like, it says, leaders are responsible for their world and we're all leaders. And there's an invitation to take that responsibility, which is the agency I think that you're describing. And I kind of like that. Anyway, thank you. Thank you, Kat. This has been a really interesting conversation. We should do it again because I think that we could do a part 2 real easy. But until then, if folks want to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
LinkedIn is where I spend most of my time. So that's easy to reach out to me. Happy to set up a conversation outside of LinkedIn, but that's the best way to reach me.
Fantastic. So they can connect with you on LinkedIn. They could click the button and everyone knows how LinkedIn works, and you're connected to this event on LinkedIn as well as the speaker.
Perfect.
So that's fantastic.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And everyone, I'm Todd. You can reach me at toddkarges.com or here on LinkedIn or on YouTube. You know how to get me. This is Coaching Conversation. Are you curious about power? And Kat, it's been a delight. Thank you so much, as always.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure again. Thank you.
Okay. See you around.